Are you struggling to make your home recording studio sound better? Do you want a tight, accurate low end? Are you frustrated by all the conflicting information on the internet? If you answered yes to all three of those things, then you are in the right place by watching this video. I'm going to explain to you how to get a tight, accurate low end. Keep it simple so you don't constantly keep losing sleep at night thinking, how am I going to build this thing? Or like a Helmholtz resonator or a diaphragmatic absorber. And I'm just going to give it to you straight so you can implement this right after watching this video and start getting those things in your studio. Before we jump in, I do have a free resource for you. If you are going down this path of trying to acoustically treat your home recording studio, then check out my free acoustic treatment guide. It's at soundproofyourstudio.com/acoustic. This will give you even more in-depth information on where to buy acoustic panels, where to play some things like that, and I highly recommend checking it out. Again, it's at soundproofyourstudio.com/acoustic. All right, enough of me blabbering. Let's dive into this lesson on stop overthinking acoustic treatment in your home recording studio. Here we go. It's all about that bass. This is the first thing we're going to talk about. You can absorb everything using broadband acoustic panels in your room. Number one, you need to install floor to ceiling bass traps in the four corners of your room. Ideally, you're starting with a rectangular room with a good room ratio, and then you fill those corners with acoustic bass traps. These can be just acoustic panels that straddle the corner, or it can be specifically like flush corner bass traps that you buy from some acoustic panel company. It doesn't matter. The point is floor to ceiling absorption. Next, this is something most people do not ever think about, but put Soffit bass traps in the top corners of your room. Again, these are corners as well, where the wall and the ceiling meet. So all the way around the perimeter of your studio at the ceiling, there should be acoustic soffits. This could be just acoustic panels that straddle that corner, or it could be rectangular soffits that are basically insulation covered in fabric that fill up that corner to help absorb low frequencies in the corners. Now, as we dive into this video, I want to give you some very clear and simple advice. 4-inch thick insulation is pretty much the maximum I recommend for all of my clients. The reason being that beyond 4 inches, I think you're spending more money on insulation and getting less value for the amount of money you're spending. I think 4 inches of insulation plus at least a 1-inch air gap behind the panels is what's going to give you the most value. Now, with corner traps and things like that, you want to get as big of an air gap as possible because that's where you're getting more low end. The larger the air gap behind your absorption panel, the greater its ability to absorb low frequencies in your room. That is very important, so don't forget that. Number two, cover as much of the back wall of your room as possible with, again, you guessed it, 4-inch thick absorptive panels with at least a 1-inch air gap. If you can move those acoustic panels off your back wall, you're going to get even more low end absorption. The more we move our acoustic panels off that back wall, we know that we're going to lose more space in our recording studio. So it's important to find that perfect give and take where we're like, okay, we're worried about acoustics, but we also need to use the studio for practical purposes. So I'm very much on that practical end of acoustic treatment, and that's what I recommend you guys do. I'll say real quick, a lot of people want to put diffusion on their back wall. This is a great idea if you already have plenty of absorption on the back wall, especially behind the diffuser. Since many of us in the home recording studio world don't have a ton of space to give up on our back wall, you may see fancy studios that have like a cool quadratic diffuser on the back wall. Well, what you don't see is all the low end absorption that's going behind that quadratic diffuser, helping with the low frequencies so that the quadratic diffuser is only helping with the mid to high frequencies. This is why we got to be careful what we see on the internet. Number three, I want you to hang acoustic clouds, which are acoustic panels hung from the ceiling, in as much of the square footage of your ceiling as possible for your budget and for your space. The reason being that axial modes that go both front to back, left to right, and floor to ceiling are the biggest problems with low end in our room. So the more we can absorb those axial modes as they bounce forward and backward between the floor and the ceiling, the better. Now, the same thing applies with everything in our room acoustics, which is the 4-inch thick insulation, like I said, and as much space behind that panel as possible. So the lower you can bring down your ceiling cloud, the better it will absorb those top to bottom axial modes that are happening, and the better you're going to absorb those low frequencies. Now, there's obviously a limit with this. You could hang your panel all the way till it's touching the top of your head, but that's ridiculous. So we always give and take with home recording studios. We're not building multi-million dollar professional studios. They need to be great, but they don't have to be perfect. And done is better than perfect. And making music in your studio and moving on with your life is better than obsessing over room acoustics. Number 4. Treat your side walls. So the left and the right wall to either side of your listening position on your left and your right ear needs to be treated with, you guessed it, 4-inch thick acoustic panels with at least a 1-inch air gap. You're seeing the theme here. The reason is that if you go with thinner panels, you're technically not absorbing as much of the low frequencies, which is what we're still trying to do even on our walls. I think there's this misconception in the acoustic world that the low frequencies are only treated in our corners. The truth is the low frequencies are absorbed most efficiently in our corners, but low frequencies are everywhere in the room and they build up against our walls. Like I said, the axial modes, as they're bouncing back and forth between the left and the right wall, is where you can get a lot of low end absorption. So again, the farther off the wall you can get those panels, the better your low end absorption will be. But again, usually 1 inch is enough for most home recording studios to get adequate low absorption for our purposes. So again, put those as much as you can directly to the left and right of your listening position for what's known as the reflection free zone, so you can have accurate monitoring from your monitors. And then in the back of the room, what I like to do is actually stagger my acoustic panels so that on one side of the wall, they're absorbing where there's blank space on the other side to reduce the slap echo back and forth. If you can afford to put absorption all the way across the back end of your wall on both sides evenly, great, that's awesome. But I'm just trying to tell you what's most efficient so you can get the most bang for your buck. So, number 5, what about the front wall? I haven't mentioned the front wall behind your speakers, what you face when you're listening to music at all. And the reason is that I don't want you to put any acoustic panels on the front wall. I know, crazy, right? I even have acoustic panels on my front wall, which technically I don't think I should have. My room is not the room you guys should be watching for perfect acoustics. I've learned so much since I did my own room. And so I'm teaching you what you should do, not what I did 5 years ago. I'm teaching you what I wish I had known 5 years ago. So on that front wall, what I want you to do is just push your speakers right up against that front wall. There should be no space behind the back of your speaker and that front wall. Obviously, you need to angle them, so get them as close as you can. The reason is that there's something called speaker boundary interference response, also known as SBIR for short. It's a super nerdy term that basically says the farther you pull your speakers off the front wall, the worse your low end is going to be in your room. So since we're talking a lot about room acoustics and low end, this has nothing to do with acoustic panels and everything to do with getting accurate room acoustics in your room from your speakers, which means push those dang things right up against the wall, and that will help you tremendously with hearing the accurate bass in your room. So once you've done that, don't put anything on the front wall. And the reason being is that I am designing this based off this concept of a non-environmental room, which has been done since the 70s. It's a common idea in the control room world of acoustics, but it transfers really well to the single room home recording studio acoustics as well. And the idea is that your front wall and your floor are left open so that you have a bright reflective surface while the rest of the room is absorptive. This gives just enough life in your room so that you can hear an accurate low end response and accurate mid and high frequencies from your monitors, but you don't get that fatigue of being in an anechoic chamber. Now, if I had a nickel for every time someone said they didn't want their room to sound too dead, I would be a very rich man. So a lot of you guys might be hearing this and saying, Wilson, I don't want to do this. I don't want an anechoic chamber. I don't want my room to be too dead. Trust me, if you're just putting acoustic panels on your wall and not covering every square inch with absorption, you're probably going to have a very nice live room as is. However, if it's still too dead for you, you can then start to liven the room back up by bringing in diffusion into the room. So notice I had you absorb the room first. So we kill the room, we get it absorptive, we control the low end, we control the bass, and then we subtly bring in diffusion to taste, meaning you have to listen. There's no formula that will tell you how much diffusion you want. This is to taste. and you need to figure that out and decide how your perfect room is. Now, this is super important in the room like I have, where we do mixing on the front end, recording like drums on the back end, and it's a one-room studio, which is what most people are building these days, is to have your diffusion maybe more in the back end of the studio, so you have that livelier sound, and the front end of your studio is still very absorptive, so you have a more controlled sound. There's this argument on the internet about diffusion on the front end in your mix position. Some people are like, oh my God, it expands, it sounds incredible, it sounds amazing. What you're not realizing is that sometimes diffusion actually can blur the image or distort the accurate image. So while it may sound amazing in your studio, when you transition to your car and listen to it in your car, it might not sound as grand and big because you don't have diffusion in your car. So you weren't getting an accurate listening position from your monitor. So keep that in mind. This is something that I'm always kind of on the fence about, but I truly believe that if you want accurate monitoring, absorption is going to be your best friend. All right, number 6. This is a lot of information here, but number 6 is, why do I not recommend diaphragmatic absorption or Helmholtz resonators? If you do a deep dive on acoustics on the internet, you've probably come to the realization that, oh my gosh, I need to build a diaphragmatic absorber, and I need to look at all these fancy mathematical calculations, and I need to get the lip mass membrane correct, and I need to build the depth correct, and if you're building a Helmholtz resonator, you need to get the tube just right so it resonates at the right frequency, blah, 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 and stop. That is going to drive you crazy. It drove me crazy. I read about it, I learned about it, and I learned just enough to know that at the end of the day, I didn't like that idea, and here's why. With diaphragmatic absorbers and Helmholtz resonators, they do in fact absorb down to even 20 hertz, the threshold, the lowest we can hear as humans. And you might be like, awesome, Wilson, I'm going to go build one. And it makes common sense. But here's what you don't know. Here's what the internet doesn't tell you readily, is that those are extremely inefficient. You would have to build a gigantic diaphragmatic absorber covering most of the walls of your studio to effectively absorb low frequencies in your room at all the different low frequency room modes that you have. You would then lose so much space in your room that you would be like, I can't actually record in here again. And you still would have done nothing for the mid to high frequencies, meaning you'd have to hang acoustic panels on top of all those diaphragmatic absorbers and Helmholtz resonators to still absorb properly in your room to get the mid to high frequencies and even some of the low end frequencies. So that, my friends, is why no one in their right mind building home recording studios should obsess over putting in diaphragmatic absorbers. And Helmholtz resonators. The only time I use what are known as pressure traps, which are what these are, they trap low end based on pressure, is if you have done everything I mentioned above in this video already, by putting absorption in all your corners, the top of the ceiling and the soffits, the back wall, the side walls, hanging your acoustic clouds over as much of the ceiling as possible. If you did all of that, and you do a REW, a room EQ wizard test at your listening position in the room, and you're like, man, there's still like some room resonance, let's say at like 68 hertz, and you see this peak or a null in your listening position, you're not hearing that 60 hertz, which is really important for the kick drum, and you're just like, okay, I'm going to build a diaphragmatic absorber, and I'm going to have to build like maybe 4 of them, because again, it takes a lot of them to do anything to your room. And then you'd have to place them in certain points of your room where they're most effective at absorbing that specific low frequency. It's very technical. It's very challenging. You probably won't get it right on your first time. So you're going to waste a ton of time on materials and money just trying to get it right. And then you might not get it right in the end. If you want to know what I'm talking about, watch Eric Valentine's videos where he's like obsessing over resonators and Helmholtz resonators and diaphragmatic absorbers. And he ends up just filling his room with absorptive tube traps. So if you want to go down that route, you can. So anyways, long rant ending there. Basically, do not touch them. Do not obsess over the math. Do not waste time on YouTube thinking you're doing something important when you're actually just wasting time and procrastinating from what you should actually be doing with your home studio. Conclusion. Now that I have just ranted and told you all about why you shouldn't do that, here's what you should do. You need to put bass traps in your corners, floor to ceiling, get as much airspace behind them, use 4 inches at a minimum, and you will be good to go. You need to put bass soffit traps. These could be just regular rectangle traps hung across the top corner of your room all the way around, as much square footage as you can cover up there, or they could be like rectangular Soffit traps from like GIK Acoustics. They have these bass Soffit traps that I use in my studio designs. Then you need to hang absorptive 4-inch absorption with a 1-inch air gap at least on your back wall. Cover as much of the back wall as you can afford. The more, the better. Then you need to hang acoustic panels from your ceiling as much as possible. The more you can, the better. The most you can afford, the better. Hang them as low as you possibly can. 4 inches, the bigger the air gap, the better the low end absorption. Then you cover your left and right walls. Remember, the front of the room where you listen and mixing, that needs to be very, very tight absorption. We don't want a lot of drywall there where you can get reflections back and forth at your ears. And then the back of the room can be a little bit more forgiving, where you're just trying to get rid of slap echo and reduce some of the axial modes left to right that are happening in the back end of the room. And lastly, leave that front wall untreated unless you really, really need to. And if it's too dead at the end of all that, you can always reintroduce some diffusion in the back end of your room to give it a little more life. All right, guys, I hope that was super helpful. That was a fun video for me. Do not overthink. Stop overthinking acoustic treatment. It drives me crazy seeing all these people obsessing over it, especially as someone who shall not be named, who always recommends activated carbon and these diaphragmatic traps. You know, obviously, I'm not in that school of thought. No shame. If you want to go that route, just be careful. And yeah, so anyways, I hope this was really helpful in understanding what you should do. If you guys are on this journey, definitely check out that free acoustic treatment guide at soundproofyourstudio.com/acoustic. And if you're like, Wilson, this was awesome, I love learning from you, but you know what? I don't have the time. I don't have the time for this. I don't want to do this all myself. I want you to do it for me. Then reach out for a Soundproof clarity call. I am happy to help you. I call it do it together. Instead of DIY, let's DIT, do it together. Just go to soundproofyourstudio.com, click on the Soundproof clarity call button, and I'd be happy to do a 30-minute Zoom call with you. All right, everybody. 2 amazing home recording studios where you spend more time making beautiful music and less time obsessing over all this stuff on the internet. I'm here to help you get through that hump so you can get back to making music in your studio. All right, I'll see y'all next week with more information on soundproofing and room acoustics. Thank you all for liking, subscribing. If you're on the podcast, leave a review. Apparently that helps a lot. I haven't put a ton of effort into the podcast, but if you're listening, I love you. Thank you. And peace.